The chandeliers burned too brightly that night, as if even the light itself wanted to remind him he didn't belong. Glass clinked, heels clicked across polished marble, and in the center of it all, a man in a pressed black jacket carried trays like a shadow. No one asked his name. Few even glanced at him. And when they did, their eyes slid away with that familiar mix of impatience and dismissal. His name was Gabriel Alvarez, 33 years old, once the top of his class at the university, once the man whose ideas were whispered about in conference rooms, once the son who promised his mother that he would build something worthy of her sacrifices. But here, at the annual gala of Cole Enterprises, he was nothing more than the help. By day, he scrubbed floors and polished brass, the smell of ammonia clinging to his hands. By night, he slipped into a server's jacket. It was all in the seasonal contract under Sarah, event manager, in charge of the entire service crew at Cole. 2 jobs, 1 paycheck, 1 rule: stay invisible. Careful with that, a voice snapped as he steadied a tray of champagne flutes. A woman in a sequined gown didn't even slow down, didn't even look at him when her diamond bracelet brushed against his sleeve. Her laughter carried forward to her circle, where they spoke about vacations and deals and property as if nothing else in the world existed. Gabriel inhaled slowly, keeping his hands steady. He had learned to survive nights like this by making himself invisible. The less they noticed him, the safer he felt. But invisibility has a way of cutting into a man. At the head of the room, Edward Cole, the CEO, laughed too loudly, his voice carrying over the string quartet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, perfectly groomed, the kind of presence that commanded attention without even asking for it. Tonight, he was surrounded by donors and board members, everyone leaning toward him as if he alone carried oxygen. Gabriel passed their table just as Edward's gaze flicked sideways. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Cold, gray, unblinking. And then Edward's mouth curved in a faint smirk. "You missed a spot," Edward said, nodding toward the polished floor. The words were quiet, but sharp enough for the nearest guests to hear. A ripple of laughter followed. Gabriel lowered his head, moved past. He heard one of the guests whisper, "How do people like that end up in a room like this?" It was not the first time, but tonight, it carried differently. At another table, Edward's mother sat quietly. Eleanor Cole, silver hair pinned neatly, hands resting on the tablecloth. She tried to speak to a guest beside her, but the woman only smiled thinly and turned back to Edward's booming voice. Eleanor's fingers moved subtly in the air, shapes that almost looked like words. No one noticed. Gabriel noticed. He'd seen those gestures before, back when he was still a student volunteering at the community center. Sign language. He understood enough to catch fragments. Music. Remember. Please. Eleanor had lived with severe hearing loss for years. She preferred to sign, though she could voice short, clear sentences when she chose. Most people around her never bothered to learn either truth. His chest tightened, but before he could move closer, Sarah, the event manager, hissed at him from the corner. "Alvarez, move faster. Table 7 is waiting. And keep your head down." He obeyed. He always obeyed. Still, he could feel the sting. Not just from Sarah's tone, not just from Edward's jab, but from the way every face in the room seemed to pass through him like he wasn't real. The young man who once had a voice in boardrooms, now reduced to a shadow carrying bottles worth more than his weekly pay. He thought of his younger brother, still believing Gabriel would find a way back into the life that was stolen from them. He thought of his mother, gone now, but who used to whisper, "Dignity is not what they give you, it's what you hold on to." It was hard to hold on in a room where every glance was a reminder that he did not exist. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut across his thoughts. He turned. Edward Cole stood closer than expected, his presence pressing down like a weight. "The wine." You've been circling the room with it for 20 minutes. Yes, sir. Gabriel lifted the bottle. Edward didn't take it. Instead, he jerked his chin toward his mother. She's been trying to get your attention for 10 minutes. Do your job properly. The guests at the table chuckled, enjoying the little performance. Edward's eyes never left Gabriel's face. The message was clear. You are beneath me. Gabriel swallowed, turned toward Eleanor. She was watching him, her eyes bright with something fragile, almost desperate. She lifted her hand again, shaping words in the air. This time, Gabriel responded. Quietly, his own hands moved. Good evening. How can I help you? The change was instant. Eleanor's whole expression lit with relief. Her fingers danced quickly. Beautiful song. Remind me. Paris. Gabriel nodded. He signed back. I'll tell the musicians. They will play it for you. He stepped to the quartet, leaned toward the first violinist, and murmured, La vie en rose, just a verse, please. Sarah, watching from the service rail, gave a quick nod. The first violinist caught it. Then bows lifted and fell together. The room shifted. Conversations faltered. People noticed. They had never seen a server pause to communicate like this. Never seen one of the invisible suddenly become visible. Edward's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening, and in that silence, Gabriel felt both terror and something else. A small, dangerous spark of dignity returning. He knew what everyone was thinking. Why does he know this? Who is he really? Questions hung in the air heavier than the chandelier light. He bowed slightly to Eleanor, then stepped back, his hands steady, though his pulse thundered. In that moment, a memory surfaced of his mother telling him, Never let them take away your humanity, Gabriel. Even if they take everything else. It was a dangerous thing, to be seen again. But once seen, you could not go back to being invisible. People in rooms like this rarely ask about the stories of those who serve them. But maybe you've been in a place like Gabriel, dismissed, treated as if you didn't matter. If you have, I'd love to hear how you carried yourself through it. Share it with us, because someone else listening might need the strength of your story too. Gabriel returned to his duties, but whispers trailed him now. Sarah's eyes narrowed from across the room. One guest muttered, Where did he learn that? Another, Why would someone like him bother? At the head of the table, Edward leaned toward his mother. Don't encourage him, he said under his breath. Eleanor only shook her head, her eyes never leaving Gabriel. The quartet swelled, but the air in the room had changed. Gabriel felt it in every step. He took the shift from unseen shadow to an object of scrutiny, and scrutiny was dangerous. He adjusted the tray in his hands, forcing his breathing steady. He could endure it. He had endured worse. But beneath the calm exterior, questions clawed at him. How long before Edward demanded answers? How long before this fragile spark of recognition turned into exposure? He told himself not to think about it. He had one job. Serve, survive, leave unseen. But the truth was already out. The eyes that once dismissed him now lingered too long. The room that once erased him now weighed heavy with curiosity. And in Edward's cold smile, Gabriel saw the first sign of something dangerous. Not amusement anymore, but suspicion. Suspicion that could shatter the fragile anonymity Gabriel had built. Suspicion that could drag his buried past into the glaring light of the chandeliers. Gabriel steadied the tray, keeping his head low. But he knew it. Nothing would be the same after tonight. The string quartet kept the slow melody he'd set in motion earlier, and half the guests were no longer listening. Their attention flicked again and again toward the far end of the head table, where something unusual had just happened. Eleanor Cole leaned closer, her silver hair glinting under the lights. Her hands moved with more certainty now, gestures precise, as though some invisible door had opened. Gabriel caught her eyes and responded again, his motions deliberate but respectful. He didn't rush, didn't hide. The message between them was simple. You're not alone. I hear you. The hush that followed felt unnatural for a ballroom filled with the city's most powerful. Conversations stalled. The violinists hesitated, their bows hovering mid-air. Waiters paused with trays mid-step. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. And in that hush, Eleanor's face lit up with the kind of joy only recognition can bring. Her hands spelled out a request. A melody she had loved in Paris. A song that carried the weight of decades, of memories that mattered only to her. Gabriel nodded. He turned back to the musicians, repeating the title softly. The quartet exchanged a glance, then the notes rose again, the familiar refrain drifting across the room. Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned to Gabriel, mouthing the words as if she were singing, and for a few fragile moments, the gala belonged to her. The guests sat frozen. Some looked moved, others uncomfortable. But everyone was watching Eleanor's lips form every lyric, watching Gabriel stand quietly beside her, offering nothing more than the dignity of being heard. At the far end of the table, Edward's smile thinned into a hard line. His knuckles tapped against the crystal stem of his glass. Once, twice. The room felt it, the tension of a man used to controlling every detail, now losing command of the moment. Impressive, one guest murmured. Another whispered, "Where did he learn that?" Eleanor reached for Gabriel's hand, squeezing it lightly. Her fingers brushed his sleeve as if to say thank you in a way words couldn't. And then Edward stood. The scrape of his chair echoed louder than the music. His voice cut clean through the song. "That's enough." The quartet faltered, notes stumbling. Conversations didn't resume, everyone waited, breath caught. Edward's eyes locked on Gabriel. Cold, sharp, calculating. "Serve the table." Nothing more. It wasn't shouted, but the authority in it was absolute. Gabriel bowed slightly, stepping back, tray balanced in his hands. He could feel the eyes drilling into him from every angle, but in his chest, something stubborn refused to bend. For 2 years he had lived erased, careful to never draw notice, careful to never risk exposure. Yet a single song had broken through that wall. Eleanor had seen him, the entire hall had seen him, and no command from Edward could erase that memory. Still, danger pressed close. Suspicion lived now in the narrowed eyes of the CEO. As Gabriel moved away, he heard fragments from the guests. He studied, you can tell. Not just some waiter. Strange that someone like him ended up here. Every whisper was both recognition and threat. At the service station, Sarah hissed at him. "What do you think you're doing? You don't speak to guests unless spoken to. You're making trouble for yourself, Alvarez." He set the tray down, steady. "She wanted to be heard. She's not your problem." Sarah's voice dropped lower. "And if Mr. Cole decides you're a problem, you won't last a day." He said nothing. But the truth was already written in the room. The music resumed, but it was different now. Softer, tentative, like the musicians themselves weren't sure where to look. The hum of conversations returned, but lighter, fragmented. Every now and then, Gabriel felt eyes flick toward him. Curiosity lingered in the air like static. He refilled glasses. Careful, controlled. But with every step, he knew what had shifted. He was no longer invisible. Eleanor smiled at him again when their eyes met. Gratitude. Affection. Recognition. And beside her, Edward sat rigid, his jaw tight, his hand drumming once more against the glass. It wasn't over. It was only beginning. The night ended, but it didn't fade. By the next morning, the whispers had already escaped the ballroom. At the cafe across the street from Cole Enterprises, a pair of assistants replayed the moment in hushed voices. The old woman signing, the server replying. You should have seen the look on Edward's face. By noon, it was circulating in offices and boardrooms, a strange story of a nameless waiter who had stilled a gala filled with the city's wealthiest. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something had shifted that night. Gabriel kept his head down. He clocked in, collected his supplies, scrubbed floors, polished brass. He'd learned long ago that the best way to survive was to move quietly, to let gossip pass over like a storm. But storms don't always pass. Sometimes they circle back. Stronger. Sarah cornered him near the service entrance. Cole's office called, she whispered, eyes darting. They asked your full name, your record, everything. Gabriel nodded once, though his stomach tightened. He expected this. He'd seen the suspicion in Edward's eyes. The problem was not his name. The problem was everything that followed it. Once, the name Gabriel Alvarez had opened doors. He'd been the scholarship kid who graduated with honors, the young strategist whose presentations made older men take notes. He'd been offered a junior role at a firm whose glass towers gleamed across the river. And for a while, he believed merit was enough, until the man he trusted most, his former mentor, gutted his career in a single move. False accusations, carefully placed doubts, just enough to stain his reputation. Overnight, meetings dried up. Opportunities vanished. His name stopped being an asset and became a liability. The betrayal cut deeper than poverty ever had. Poverty, he knew how to fight. But betrayal? That left him without weapons. So he disappeared. Took work where no one asked questions. Wore the uniform of invisibility until the world stopped looking for him. Until last night, he closed his locker slowly, staring at his own reflection in the metal door. A man erased, still carrying the fragments of who he had been. In the corner leaned an old guitar his mother left behind, strings worn, case scuffed. On some weekends, he brought it to the community center and taught the kids 3 chords and a melody, as if music could stitch a person together. 3 days later, Eleanor Cole asked for him by name. The request came quietly, through Sarah, who looked torn between warning him and following orders. She wants to see you, Sarah muttered. I'd advise against it. Mr. Cole won't like it. But Gabriel went. Eleanor waited in a sunlit lounge, away from the noise of the executive offices. She looked smaller without the weight of jewels and ballroom lights, but her eyes were clear. You signed, she said softly, her voice faint but certain. No one here ever signs with me. Gabriel sat across from her, careful, respectful. I learned when I volunteered at the community center. Her smile deepened. My family never bothered. Too busy. Too proud. But you listened. It wasn't flattery. It was gratitude, quiet and genuine. And for Gabriel, it was heavier than applause. They spoke in fragments. About the song. About Paris. About the loneliness of being in a room full of people who pretend not to see you. At one point, she asked, Why are you here, Gabriel? Not here in this room. Here. He hesitated. His instinct was to retreat, to say nothing. But her gaze held the kind of weight that stripped excuses away. I needed work, he said simply. It was the truth. Just not the whole of it. Eleanor nodded, as though she understood more than he had spoken. Edward thinks power means never needing anyone. He doesn't understand that to be seen is sometimes all a person asks. Her words were quiet, but in them, Gabriel heard a lifetime of disappointment. Before he left, she touched his hand lightly. Don't let him erase you. Not again. Again. She had said it like she knew. Edward, meanwhile, was moving differently. He called for background checks. Quiet inquiries. Find out where Alvarez came from, he ordered his assistant. And why he's here. The tone wasn't casual curiosity, it was threat disguised as efficiency. At the next board luncheon, Edward played the genial host. But beneath the surface, his mind circled one problem. The stranger who had unsettled his mother, unsettled his control. In every empire, cracks start small, and Edward could feel the crack widening. That night, Gabriel walked home through streets slick with rain. Neon reflected in puddles, blurring colors, faces, sounds. He kept his coat pulled tight, but the chill came from inside. He thought about the way people had looked at him in the gala, not as invisible, but as suspicious, as though being more than what he appeared was an offense in itself. And he thought of Eleanor's hand squeezing his, telling him not to let them erase him. For the first time in years, he wondered if he still had something left to reclaim. The week pressed on, tasks doubled, breaks cut short. Every mistake, no matter how minor, was noted with a sharp word from Sarah. But Gabriel knew it wasn't her. Orders rolled downhill, and he could see where they began. Edward Cole had decided to remind him who controlled the building. At one luncheon, Gabriel was ordered to polish silver, while guests were still eating. At another, he was made to clear plates before dessert, the awkwardness drawing snickers from the board members. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about humiliation. Wrapped in the excuse of management, Gabriel endured it, steady, expressionless. Every cut glanced off him, without reaction. But inside, the weight pressed heavier. On Thursday, a donor remarked too loudly, "The help looks tired." Edward's reply carried across the table. That's what happens when a man isn't built for real responsibility. Laughter followed. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. Her eyes, sharp despite age, pinned her son. "Enough," she said quietly. The room froze. For a heartbeat, Edward looked like a boy caught in a lie. Then the mask slid back, his smile cold. "Of course, Mother." Gabriel bowed his head, collecting dishes. But the silence in the room was heavier than the laughter had been. Guests exchanged glances. Whispers traveled faster now, not just about the strange server, but about Edward himself. The following weekend brought the annual winter benefit. A hall larger than the first, more cameras, more donors. Edward treated it like theater, every detail rehearsed to project control. But theater has a way of betraying its director. When the quartet paused between pieces, Eleanor leaned forward. Her hands moved deliberately. Song. Again. Gabriel hesitated. Too many eyes. Too much risk. But Eleanor's gaze held steady, asking, not commanding. So he nodded. The musicians adjusted, uncertain. Then the melody began, soft at first, rising gently into the vaulted ceiling. Eleanor closed her eyes. She mouthed the lyrics. Her shoulders, always so stiff at these events, relaxed. The guests watched. Cameras clicked. The sight of the CEO's mother, alive with joy, connected to the server everyone else ignored. It was the kind of image people remembered. And when the last note faded, the room did not erupt in chatter. It fell into a hush more powerful than applause. Edward stood quickly, filling the gap. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Let's continue." His voice was smooth, but too sharp, too rushed. The spell had already broken. People had seen, and they would not unsee. Later in the service hall, Sarah grabbed Gabriel's arm. "Do you know what you're doing? You don't play with people like him. He'll destroy you." Gabriel shook her grip off gently. "I didn't play?" she asked. Sarah's face tightened, torn between fear and sympathy. "Then pray he forgets it." But Gabriel knew Edward wouldn't forget. Not now. The next morning, in the executive offices, Edward leaned against his desk, voice low but lethal. "He's not just a waiter. He speaks languages, carries himself like he's been in boardrooms. I want every record, Every scrap of history. Find out what he's hiding. His assistant hesitated. And if there's nothing? Edward's smile was thin. Then make sure there is. That afternoon, Gabriel carried trays past a group of junior staff whispering in the corner. He caught fragments. That's him. Cole's mother adores him. I heard he studied at Columbia, or maybe Harvard. Rumor inflated. Details invented. But one truth remained. Invisibility was gone, and with visibility came danger. The executive dining hall was crowded, laughter rolling across polished tables. Gabriel carried a tray toward the corner when Edward's voice cut through the noise. "You again," Edward said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "The board is paying for silver service, not a show." The laughter was nervous this time, not free. Some glanced down at their plates, others toward Eleanor, seated nearby. She set her fork down slowly, her eyes fixed on her son. Gabriel bowed his head. "Yes, sir." Edward leaned back, glass in hand. "Do you understand your role here?" Silence spread. Thin and sharp. Gabriel kept his voice even. "To serve." Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Exactly. To serve. Not to be seen. Not to be remembered." The words landed like blows. Eleanor's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Gabriel moved to step away. Edward's hand shot out, tapping the rim of his glass against the tray. "Careful," he said. "Wouldn't want you to drop something." A ripple of unease passed through the room. No one laughed. Not this time. The air thinned. Gabriel met Edward's gaze just once steady, unflinching. Then he turned and walked on, not rushing, not stumbling. It was a small act, but in a room built on fear, it was louder than defiance. By evening, the story had legs. Someone from the luncheon had spoken. A journalist ran with it under a headline meant to sting: "The CEO who publicly mocked his own mother's companion." It was skewed. The press loves a cleaner character, misframing Gabriel as a companion, though he was staff, but it traveled. Forums, investor group chats, little fires catching. Edward raged behind closed doors. "A companion? He's a janitor," he snapped at his assistant. "Find out who leaked this." The assistant hesitated. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is people saw." Edward's fist slammed the desk. "Then we'll remind them what they saw. We'll show them he's nothing." Gabriel heard the fallout secondhand. Whispers among staff. A glance from a guard that lingered too long. An email accidentally printed and left in plain sight, with his name circled, underlined, marked with notes. He considered leaving. It would be safer. Disappear. Before the storm truly broke. But as he walked home, he thought of Eleanor's words. "Don't let him erase you. Not again." And he thought of the look in Edward's eyes, when the room had chosen hush over laughter. For the first time since he'd fallen, Gabriel felt a choice pressing on him. Hide again, or stand in the open. He wasn't sure which frightened him more. The next gala came sooner than expected, an emergency benefit to salvage image. Cameras lined the walls, reporters scribbling notes, investors watching closely. Edward performed flawlessly, shaking hands, delivering speeches, smiling with precision. Until Eleanor requested the song again. The request was simple, soft, but it echoed. Every guest heard it. Every camera turned. Edward froze. His smile faltered, and in that pause, Gabriel stepped forward. He nodded once, signaling the musicians. The melody rose, filling the hall with the same aching notes. Eleanor sang under her breath, tears bright in her eyes. Guests leaned forward, captivated. The story was no longer private. It was public, undeniable, unfolding in real time before witnesses and cameras. Edward's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the glass he held. When the song ended, The hush was overwhelming. Then applause. Not polite, not staged, but real. Applause for Eleanor, for Gabriel, for the moment of dignity in a room obsessed with power, and Edward stood in the middle of it, powerless. Later, in the service corridor, Sarah whispered urgently, "He's going to destroy you. You've humiliated him in front of everyone. If you stay, he'll find a way." Gabriel shook his head. "If I leave, he wins." Sarah stared at him, torn. "You're braver than most." He didn't feel brave. He felt hunted. But he also felt something he hadn't in years. Unbroken. The invitations called it a community forum. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to calm shareholders and quiet the press. Edward stood at the front of the hall, flanked by banners and assistants. His voice carried smoothly, measured, designed to project confidence. But confidence is fragile when the room no longer believes. The crowd was different this time. Not donors in sequins, not politicians with practiced handshakes. These were staff, local press, smaller investors, people who'd read the headlines, watched the clips, whispered about the strange janitor and the mother who smiled only when he was near. And sitting in the front row, Eleanor Cole. Edward spoke of numbers, strategy, reputation. He spoke of dignity while avoiding the word itself. Then a voice rose from the audience. "What about him?" All eyes turned. Gabriel had been assigned to serve in the hall, trays at his side, invisible as always. But now, invisibility was gone. The question hung in the air, undeniable. Edward's jaw tightened. "He is staff." The murmurs grew louder. Eleanor stood, her frame small but her voice cutting. "He is not just staff. He is the only one who listened when no one else did." The hall stilled. Edward tried to recover. "Mother, please. This isn't the place." "It is exactly the place," she said firmly. "If you speak of community, then let the community hear him." Gasps echoed. Cameras shifted. Reporters leaned forward. Edward hesitated. He had built an empire on control, but in this room, control was slipping through his fingers. "Fine," he said finally, cold and sharp. "If he has something to say, let him say it." The spotlight shifted. Gabriel set the tray down carefully. His hands felt steady, though his chest burned. He looked out at the rows of faces, at Eleanor's expectant eyes, at Edward's glare. He did not raise his voice. "I am here because I needed work. That is the truth. But there is more to me than a uniform." The hall listened. "My mother grew up in a small village. She taught me songs in her language, songs that carried dignity when nothing else did. When I saw Mrs. Cole signing in a room that pretended not to hear, I remembered those songs. I remembered what it meant to be heard." A ripple passed through the audience. "I didn't mean to draw attention. I only meant to answer her. But when a person is dismissed long enough, sometimes the smallest acknowledgement becomes louder than power." He turned briefly toward Edward. "I was erased once before, by men who thought control was stronger than truth. I will not be erased again." The words were not angry. They were plain, and that was what made them cut deepest. The hall fell silent, the kind of silence that bends a man's pride. Edward's lips parted, but no words came. His gaze flicked to the crowd, to the cameras, to the investors whose expressions had shifted from polite loyalty to something colder, doubt. Eleanor clapped once, softly. Others followed. Within seconds, the hall rang with applause, not wild, not theatrical, but steady, undeniable. For the first time in his empire, Edward Cole was not the center. And for the first time in years, Gabriel Alvarez stood without fear of being seen. If you want to keep hearing stories where dignity is tested and truth stands up to power, I'd be glad to have you here. Edward left the stage without finishing his speech. His shoulders were rigid, his smile gone. Eleanor remained standing, her hand steady on the cane she rarely used. She turned to Gabriel as the applause faded. "You reminded them," she said. Gabriel bowed his head. "I only told the truth. And truth," she whispered, "is the one thing my son has never learned to face." The hush in that hall did not end when the cameras stopped. It followed Edward Cole into every board meeting, every investor call, every headline. Within a month, contracts were suspended. Donors asked questions that had no rehearsed answers. Some of it might have blown over, if not for the rest. An audit already delayed 3 quarters, partners irritated by drifting timelines, and a handful of old ethics complaints bubbling back to the surface now that eyes were looking. The scandal with his mother and the server who signed was the spark. The room had been filled with gas for a long time. Edward fought, but each move only deepened the fracture. His empire no longer bent to his will. The laughter he once commanded had turned to whispers, and whispers erode faster than fire. Eleanor rarely spoke at those meetings, but when she did, her words carried more weight than his. "Trust," she said simply, "is not something you purchase. It is something you keep. My son lost it." It was the closest she had ever come to disowning him. Gabriel stayed in his role for a time, steady as always, but the uniform no longer carried the same weight. He was seen now. Sometimes that made him uncomfortable. Sometimes it felt like a burden. But it was also a reminder that invisibility had been a prison, and the walls had finally broken. 6 months later, the world had moved on, as it always does. New scandals, new names. Edward retreated from the spotlight, replaced by calmer voices in the company he once ruled. And Gabriel? He stood in a school gymnasium, rows of folding chairs filled with children and parents. The air smelled of chalk and wax, far from chandeliers and marble floors. He lifted his mother's old guitar, the case he'd mended with gray tape, and strummed the opening notes of the same song Eleanor had requested. The children sang with him, their voices high and untrained, but filled with something purer than perfection. In the front row, Eleanor clapped along, her eyes glistening. She had insisted on attending, even as age slowed her. "This," she whispered to him earlier, shaping the words with her hands and voicing them softly, "is the music power could never buy." Gabriel smiled, not for the crowd, not for recognition, but for the truth of it. The dignity he thought lost had not been destroyed. It had only been waiting. When the song ended, the gym erupted in applause. Messy, uneven, real. Gabriel bowed his head. He wasn't a CEO, not a man of titles or empires. He was simply a man who refused to disappear. And sometimes, that is enough to change the story. That night, as the last of the children left with their parents, Gabriel packed his guitar into its case. Eleanor touched his arm. "You gave them a voice," she said softly. "No," he answered. "I only reminded them. They already had one." She smiled, the kind that carried both pride and peace. And in that quiet, ordinary gym, the lesson stood clear. Power may silence a room, but truth spoken, sung or signed, has the strength to still it.